What up, family? Something extremely wild just happened in hip-hop, and I need every single one of you locked in because this one is going to sting for years. 50 Cent didn't just win the war with Rick Ross. He didn't just clown him. He didn't just troll him. What 50 Cent just did to Rick Ross is the kind of career-ending checkmate that gets studied in music business classrooms. It's the kind of humiliation that follows a man into retirement. And here's the wildest part of the story. Rick Ross walked directly into the trap. He built the trap. He decorated the trap. He handed 50 Cent the key to the trap. And 50 Cent, being the ice-cold surgical assassin that he is, waited patiently in the shadows for the exact moment to snap it shut. When that trap finally closed, Rick Ross didn't just lose. Rick Ross got erased from the conversation. Album sales in the dirt. Tour tickets barely moving. Drake taking free shots from the sidelines. And 50 Cent laughing all the way to another billion-dollar business empire. This is the story of how one of the greatest rivalries in hip-hop history reached its absolute lowest point for Rick Ross, and how 50 Cent turned a beef nobody thought would ever end into a public execution. Let me break it down for you, because you cannot understand what just happened without understanding the history. 50 Cent and Rick Ross have been going at each other for close to 2 decades now. This isn't a beef. This is a lifestyle. This is a full-time occupation. And somewhere along the way, Rick Ross convinced himself that he was the one winning. Rick Ross truly believed, deep in his soul, that he had the receipts, the records, the reputation, and the resources to bury 50 Cent once and for all. So Rick Ross did what Rick Ross always does. He got on every podcast microphone he could find. He walked into every interview studio in the country, and he started swinging at 50 Cent with everything he had. Rick Ross called 50 Cent broke. Rick Ross said 50 Cent lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. Rick Ross claimed 50 Cent couldn't dress. Rick Ross went after 50 Cent's baby mama. Rick Ross even joked about slapping 50 Cent with a chain if he ever crossed his path. And through all of that noise, all of that shouting, all of that podcast tour aggression, 50 Cent said almost nothing. 50 Cent just watched. 50 Cent just waited. 50 Cent knew something Rick Ross did not know. 50 Cent knew the receipts were coming. Peep this, though, because this is the moment the whole game changed. Rick Ross dropped his brand new album. He called it Set in Stone. He built the entire campaign around the idea that he was still that guy. Still the boss. Still the biggest name in the room. Still the same Rick Ross who had been dominating hip-hop for 2 decades. And when the streaming numbers came in for Set in Stone, everything Rick Ross built came crashing down in front of the entire industry. The first week numbers were catastrophic. We are talking about a legend of the game, a mogul, a mansion-owning multimillionaire, moving barely 22,000 album equivalent units in his opening frame. 22,000. For a Rick Ross project. In week 2, the number dropped again, down to around 20,000. This wasn't a slump. This wasn't a soft launch. This was the lowest charting first-week performance of Rick Ross' entire career, according to industry reports that immediately hit the timeline. And guess who was the very first man on planet Earth to grab a phone, screenshot those numbers, and blast them across social media? 50 Cent. Of course it was 50 Cent. Because 50 Cent had been sitting on his hands for months, absorbing every insult Rick Ross could throw, knowing that Rick Ross was building the exact hangman's noose he was about to swing from. All right, next chapter of this saga, because 50 Cent didn't stop at the streaming numbers. That would have been too easy. That would have been amateur hour. 50 Cent understands the algorithm of humiliation better than any executive in this industry, and 50 Cent knew that streaming numbers alone would not fully complete the takedown. So 50 Cent went hunting for the concert receipts. And what 50 Cent found was so devastating that even Rick Ross loyalists went silent. 50 Cent posted images from what he claimed was a Rick Ross tour stop in Detroit, a venue that appeared to be nearly empty. Rows of open seats. Sections that looked completely untouched by human bodies. A sea of nothing where a Rick Ross crowd was supposed to be. Whether every single seat was verified or not, the image was already out there. The image was already going viral. The image was already being reposted across every hip-hop blog, every gossip page, every entertainment aggregator on the internet. And that image told a story that streaming numbers alone could not tell. That image told the story of a legend whose audience had quietly moved on without telling him. 50 Cent had officially transitioned from beef to psychological warfare, and Rick Ross was on the losing end of a battle he did not know how to fight. Now here is the part where a smart artist would have gone quiet. A smart artist would have taken the L, gone into the studio, worked on the next record, and let the storm pass. But Rick Ross is not built like that. Rick Ross hopped on live within hours of the takedown and tried to reframe the entire narrative. Rick Ross went on camera and told the world that low first-week numbers were actually a badge of honor. Rick Ross said the new flex was authenticity, no bots, no streaming manipulation, no inflated numbers. Rick Ross said he was playing the long game. Rick Ross said the drastic first-week fall-offs from other artists proved those other artists were faking their success. Rick Ross even took the moment to jab at 50 Cent's sneaker deal, saying the G-Unit sneakers were headed for the discount rack at Costco. Rick Ross said Lloyd Banks should have his own signature high top. Rick Ross said 50 Cent should stop bothering him and focus on his footwear brand. And in the middle of all of that livestream commentary, Rick Ross made the fatal mistake of trying to flex his mansion, asking the audience if 50 Cent could show a palm tree in his front yard, comparing his $100 million estate to whatever 50 Cent was allegedly living in. What Rick Ross did not understand, in that exact moment, is that flexing your house at 50 Cent is like bringing a butter knife to a nuclear briefing. 50 Cent doesn't lose real estate arguments. 50 Cent doesn't lose net worth arguments. 50 Cent doesn't lose business arguments. And Rick Ross had just handed 50 Cent the exact ammunition needed to end the entire feud on a permanent basis. Here's the raw truth about what makes 50 Cent so uniquely dangerous in this game. 50 Cent isn't a rapper. Not really. Not anymore. 50 Cent is a media empire wearing a rapper costume. 50 Cent owns a television production company that has generated hundreds of millions of dollars for a major network. 50 Cent owns a liquor brand that sold for a massive 9-figure valuation. 50 Cent owns real estate. 50 Cent owns music catalogs. 50 Cent owns influence. And most importantly, 50 Cent owns a documentary machine that has already been used to end other public figures with surgical precision. When 50 Cent decides to attack, he doesn't attack with bars. 50 Cent attacks with receipts, with paperwork, with lawsuits, with cameras, with distribution deals, with the full weight of a Fortune 500-style operation. Rick Ross was fighting a rap beef. 50 Cent was fighting a corporate war. And the gap between those two energies is exactly the gap that turned this entire feud into a slaughter. Don't get it confused. 50 Cent didn't wake up one morning and decide to torch Rick Ross. 50 Cent has been quietly building this moment for years. Every time Rick Ross went on a podcast and said something reckless about 50 Cent, 50 Cent screenshotted it. Every time Rick Ross claimed a business victory, 50 Cent studied the financial paperwork. Every time Rick Ross flexed a mansion or a car or a chain, 50 Cent researched the ownership records. 50 Cent runs Rick Ross like a case file. 50 Cent has folders on Rick Ross. Folders inside folders. And when the set in stone numbers dropped, 50 Cent opened the top folder, pulled out the most damaging piece of evidence he had been sitting on, and dropped it into the timeline like a smart bomb. That evidence was the streaming report. That evidence was the concert seating. That evidence was the album chart placement. That evidence was the receipts that Rick Ross had spent months daring 50 Cent to bring. And 50 Cent brought every single one of them at the exact same time. And now this is where the story gets even wilder. Because Rick Ross wasn't just getting cooked by 50 Cent. Rick Ross was suddenly getting cooked by Drake too. Drake, sitting in his own corner of the internet, decided that watching Rick Ross flail against 50 Cent was too irresistible an opportunity to pass up. Drake hopped online and started dropping subtle jabs about the state of the album market. Drake made comments about certain artists dropping records that go hello and goodbye, dropped and forgotten within a single news cycle. Drake mentioned that the last few months had been incredible for his own career. Drake mentioned that he had already dropped 3 albums back to back. And the internet immediately connected the dots. Everybody knew who Drake was subtweeting. Everybody knew Drake was pouring gasoline on the fire that 50 Cent had already lit. And Rick Ross, who had spent an enormous amount of his own career going at Drake, now had to sit and watch his oldest rival and his newest rival tag team him on the biggest stage in music. This is not a situation any artist wants to be in. This is a public isolation event. This is what happens when you spend years poking every bear in the forest and then wake up to find every bear waiting outside your front door on the same morning. But here is the part of the story that nobody in hip-hop wants to admit out loud. Rick Ross saw all of this coming. Rick Ross has been given multiple opportunities over the years to let this beef with 50 Cent die a quiet death. Rick Ross has been offered interviews, sit-downs, podcast conversations, industry reconciliations. Rick Ross has been asked directly, on camera, whether he would ever sit down with 50 Cent and squash the beef. And Rick Ross' answer has always been the same. Rick Ross has always insisted that the beef must continue. Rick Ross has always insisted that he has more to say. Rick Ross has always insisted that he is winning. Even now, even after the Set in Stone disaster, even after the empty seats went viral, even after 50 Cent laughed himself into another news cycle at Rick Ross' expense, Rick Ross is still on live streams, still on podcast microphones, still trying to spin the loss into some kind of moral victory. And that is the tragedy of this entire moment. Because at some point, a great artist has to know when the war is over. At some point, a great artist has to accept that the tide has turned. Rick Ross has not accepted that yet, and every day he refuses to accept it, 50 Cent finds another way to remind him. The receipts kept dropping. 50 Cent posted a message across his social platforms with a laughing emoji and a caption that essentially declared the war finished. 50 Cent shared images that painted Rick Ross as the lowest performing legend of the modern era. 50 Cent even joked about the number of records Rick Ross had actually moved, comparing it to what unsigned artists in a studio apartment could pull off with a laptop and a dream. And every single time 50 Cent posted, the numbers on the post exploded. Millions of impressions, hundreds of thousands of interactions, retweets, quote tweets, memes, reposts. 50 Cent was not just dominating Rick Ross on the numbers. 50 Cent was dominating the internet's conversation about Rick Ross. And in the modern music business, that dominance is the whole game. The chart placement is temporary. The tour receipts are temporary. But the meme cycle is forever. Once 50 Cent turned Rick Ross into a meme, Rick Ross' next 10 years of press became impossible. Every interview will now reference Set in Stone. Every review will now reference the empty seats. Every year-end retrospective will now include a picture of Rick Ross' 22,000 unit opening. That is what 50 Cent actually did. 50 Cent did not just win the week. 50 Cent stole the narrative of Rick Ross' entire late career era. Peep this. The empty seat photograph in particular sent shockwaves through the industry because it triggered a conversation that promoters had been having in private for months. The industry has known for a while now that veteran artists are struggling to move tickets in secondary markets. The industry has known for a while now that certain arenas have been shifting to smaller configurations to make crowds appear fuller. The industry has known for a while now that the golden era of legacy hip-hop touring is under enormous financial pressure. But nobody was talking about it publicly. Nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. 50 Cent, by posting that single image, forced the entire industry to have that uncomfortable conversation using Rick Ross as the case study. And that is why Rick Ross cannot bounce back from this quickly. Because Rick Ross is no longer just fighting 50 Cent. Rick Ross is now fighting the perception that legacy hip-hop has an audience problem. And no rapper wants to be the face of that perception. It is a career-defining stain that lasts for years. Now here is where Rick Ross really tried to save himself. And it is worth taking a moment to appreciate the effort even if it was doomed. Rick Ross went on his live stream and delivered what might have been the most philosophical rebrand attempt of his entire career. Rick Ross talked about the long game. Rick Ross talked about authenticity. Rick Ross talked about how real bosses don't chase inflated first-week numbers. Rick Ross tried to reframe 22,000 units as a symbol of purity in a corrupted industry. And you know what? In another era, that spin might have worked. In another era, that spin might have flipped the conversation. But not in this era. Not against 50 Cent. Not with Drake also sniping from the sidelines. Not with the empty concert photograph already viral. The spin didn't land because the audience had already made up its mind. And once an audience makes up its mind about a public figure, no amount of livestream philosophy is going to reverse it. Rick Ross was speaking to a crowd that had already left the building. Now here is the part where I have to be raw with you, because this is not just about Rick Ross losing to 50 Cent. This is about the deeper lesson of the entire hip-hop industry. The lesson is that you cannot go at 50 Cent unless you are prepared for a war of attrition that lasts for years. 50 Cent doesn't fight rap battles. 50 Cent fights business battles. 50 Cent fights litigation battles. 50 Cent fights documentary battles. 50 Cent fights meme battles. 50 Cent fights on every front, in every arena, on every platform, at every hour, using every tool available to him. When 50 Cent decides you are the target, your entire public life becomes a project he is willing to invest years of energy into. Just ask the other rappers who have tried to challenge 50 Cent over the last 2 decades. Ja Rule tried. Ja Rule got dismantled. Fat Joe tried. Fat Joe eventually stepped back. Diddy came into the crosshairs recently, and we all watched how that unfolded across an entire documentary. Rick Ross knew all of that history. Rick Ross watched every single one of those battles play out in real time. And Rick Ross still decided that he was going to be the one to finally take 50 Cent down. Rick Ross was wrong. Rick Ross was catastrophically wrong. Rick Ross underestimated the depth of resources, the discipline of patience, and the ruthlessness of vision that 50 Cent brings to every single conflict of his career. But here's the raw truth. Rick Ross is not finished as an artist. Rick Ross is not finished as a mogul. Rick Ross still has his mansion. Rick Ross still has his brands. Rick Ross still has his catalog. Rick Ross still has his loyal fan base. Rick Ross still has his voice. Rick Ross is not going to disappear. And that is actually what makes this beef even more fascinating. Because Rick Ross is not going to accept defeat. Rick Ross is going to keep coming. Rick Ross is going to keep dropping albums. Rick Ross is going to keep dropping diss lines. Rick Ross is going to keep taking podcast shots. And 50 Cent is going to keep responding. And keep laughing. And keep screenshotting. And keep posting. And this cycle is going to continue for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Probably until both men are literally too old to remember why they started. That is not an exaggeration. Hip-hop has a long tradition of grudges that outlive careers. And this grudge is one of the longest running in the genre's history. Alright, next chapter of this saga. Because we need to talk about what this means for the culture. Every single rapper watching this feud unfold in real time is now taking notes. Every single artist thinking about running up on 50 Cent is now reconsidering. Every single mogul who has ever had beef with anyone is now watching how 50 Cent operates and adjusting their entire strategy accordingly. Because 50 Cent has just delivered a masterclass in reputation warfare that will be studied for generations. The lesson is simple. If you are going to attack someone, make sure you have the ammunition to finish them. If you don't have the ammunition, don't start the fight. If you start the fight without the ammunition, you become the case study for what not to do. Rick Ross is now the case study. And no artist in hip-hop wants to be the next case study. That is why 50 Cent's dominance in this moment isn't just about Rick Ross. It's about every artist watching from the sidelines who is now permanently scared to poke the bear. That is what real cultural power looks like. That is what real influence looks like. That is what a real long game looks like. Now let me get into something that nobody is really talking about, because I think it deserves its own moment. Rick Ross-Drake beef also played a huge role in this current moment of vulnerability. Rick Ross went at Drake hard during the peak of Drake's own difficult year. Rick Ross participated in the pylon. Rick Ross made comments. Rick Ross posted memes. Rick Ross even had an infamous moment in Canada that went viral for all the wrong reasons. A moment 50 Cent immediately weaponized in his own posts. When you go at Drake and lose, you don't just lose to Drake. You lose to every future Drake ally who now views you as a legitimate target. And when Drake comes back and starts sniping from the sidelines during your worst album cycle in 20 years, that isn't a coincidence. That is a coordinated cultural correction. Rick Ross opened too many wars at once. Rick Ross did not have the ammunition to fight all of them. And now Rick Ross is paying the price on multiple fronts simultaneously. There is a moment in every great feud where the balance of power shifts permanently. And I want you to understand that this moment, the set-in-stone moment, is that shift. Everything before this moment was 50 Cent and Rick Ross trading punches as equals. Everything after this moment is 50 Cent standing over Rick Ross in the ring. That is not exaggeration. That is not opinion. That is what the numbers reflect. The first week performance of a Rick Ross album is a statistical measurement of Rick Ross' current cultural weight. And that measurement has just declined dramatically in public view. When your cultural weight declines, your ability to fight declines with it. When your ability to fight declines, your enemies grow bolder. When your enemies grow bolder, they attack more frequently. When they attack more frequently, your weight declines even further. This is a death spiral. This is the actual physics of celebrity feuds. And Rick Ross has just entered that death spiral in front of the entire industry. But don't get it confused. Rick Ross has survived worse moments than this. Rick Ross has survived correctional officer revelations that would have ended most rap careers. Rick Ross has survived medical emergencies that had the entire industry preparing tributes. Rick Ross has survived beef with the biggest names in hip-hop. Rick Ross has survived label drama, tour cancellations, streaming platform disputes, and a decade of headline scandals. Rick Ross is a survivor at a level most artists cannot fathom. So the idea that a bad first week is going to permanently end him is probably not accurate. The idea that empty seats in Detroit are going to keep him from touring forever is probably not accurate. Rick Ross will find a way to rebuild. Rick Ross always finds a way to rebuild. The question is not whether Rick Ross will bounce back. The question is whether Rick Ross will bounce back in time to still be relevant when the bounce arrives. Now here is where I want to zoom out and talk about the actual receipts, because a lot of you are probably wondering how we got to a place where a Rick Ross album could sell 22,000 units in a first week. And the answer is complicated. The music industry has changed at a speed that has left many legacy artists behind. Streaming has replaced traditional sales. Playlists have replaced radio. Algorithms have replaced program directors. Younger audiences have replaced the audiences that built the careers of legacy rappers. And in that new environment, the value of a legacy name is drastically different from what it used to be. A Rick Ross album in the mid-2000s would have moved 500,000 units in a first week without breaking a sweat. A Rick Ross album in the 2010s would still have moved north of 100,000. A Rick Ross album today, in this current landscape, is fighting against thousands of new artists dropping content every single week, many of whom have direct relationships with the algorithm that Rick Ross does not. This is not entirely Rick Ross' fault, but it is entirely Rick Ross' problem. And the fact that 50 Cent is currently using this problem as a weapon against him is a masterstroke of timing. Let me pull back the curtain on how 50 Cent thinks, because I don't think most people fully understand it. 50 Cent operates on what business analysts would call an asymmetric warfare framework. 50 Cent doesn't fight the way his opponents fight. 50 Cent fights the way his opponents don't expect. When Rick Ross went at 50 Cent with podcast interviews, 50 Cent didn't do more podcast interviews. 50 Cent went silent. When Rick Ross went at 50 Cent with mansion flexes, 50 Cent didn't do bigger mansion flexes. 50 Cent went to the paperwork. When Rick Ross went at 50 Cent with album promotions, 50 Cent didn't drop an album. 50 Cent screenshotted Rick Ross album sales. This is the pattern. 50 Cent fights the war Rick Ross is not prepared to fight. 50 Cent finds the angle Rick Ross has not defended. 50 Cent hits the flank while Rick Ross is guarding the front line. And that asymmetric approach is what has allowed 50 Cent to win every single major beef of his career, including this one. There is a video that has been circulating recently where 50 Cent addresses the question of why this beef never ends. And 50 Cent's answer is one of the most honest breakdowns of celebrity conflict I have ever heard. 50 Cent said that nothing else works for Rick Ross outside of mentioning 50 Cent. 50 Cent said that when things get bad for Rick Ross, he mentions 50 Cent. 50 Cent said that when Rick Ross' news cycle goes cold, he mentions 50 Cent to warm it back up. 50 Cent said that Rick Ross has essentially built a career on the infrastructure of their feud. And here is the wildest part. 50 Cent is not wrong about that. Every time Rick Ross needs a viral moment, he mentions 50 Cent. Every time Rick Ross needs a podcast headline, he mentions 50 Cent. Every time Rick Ross needs an interview clip to circulate, he mentions 50 Cent. Which means the very tool that Rick Ross has been using to stay relevant is now the exact tool that 50 Cent is using to end him. That is poetic justice on a level that scriptwriters could not invent. Rick Ross' oldest weapon has been turned into 50 Cent's newest sword. And now the internet is doing what the internet does best. The memes are relentless. The screenshots are everywhere. Every hip-hop commentary channel is running back the same footage. Every entertainment podcast is dedicating full episodes to this feud. Every barbershop conversation in the country is arguing about who really won. And the consensus is clear. 50 Cent won. 50 Cent won so decisively that even Rick Ross' most loyal supporters are having a hard time defending the performance. This is not a split decision. This is not a controversial call. This is a knockout with the entire arena on their feet. And 50 Cent, being the ice-cold entertainer he is milking every second of the victory lap. 50 Cent is posting. 50 Cent is joking. 50 Cent is laughing. 50 Cent is turning every reply into content. Because 50 Cent understands that in the modern attention economy, the celebration is worth just as much as the win itself. If you don't celebrate loudly, the audience forgets. 50 Cent is making sure the audience does not forget. But here's the raw truth about what happens next. Rick Ross is not going to give up. Rick Ross is going to regroup. Rick Ross is going to drop another album. Rick Ross is going to give another podcast interview. Rick Ross is going to appear on another live stream. Rick Ross is going to keep coming at 50 Cent because at this point it is muscle memory. And 50 Cent is going to keep countering because at this point it is entertainment. This beef is now the longest-running reality show in hip-hop, and there is no season finale in sight. Both men have built their public personas around this conflict. Both men benefit from the conflict continuing. Both men understand, at a deep level, that the day this beef ends is the day one of them loses a significant revenue stream, which is why neither of them is going to end it. They are going to keep dancing this dance forever. They are going to keep swinging at each other until they are literal senior citizens sitting on porches in matching rocking chairs, still throwing subtle jabs on Instagram Live. Let me tell you something about beef in hip-hop that gets forgotten. Beef doesn't end because someone wins. Beef ends because someone dies, retires, or decides the profit is not worth the effort anymore. Neither 50 Cent nor Rick Ross is close to any of those exit ramps. 50 Cent is at the peak of his mobile era. Rick Ross is still touring, still recording, still on podcasts, still owning businesses. The infrastructure of both men remains intact. Which means the beef remains intact. Which means we are going to be sitting here 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, watching these two hip-hop titans go at each other with the same energy they had when this whole thing started. That is not a bug of the entertainment industry. That is a feature. Public feuds sell records. Public feuds sell tickets. Public feuds sell podcasts. Public feuds sell books. Public feuds sell sneakers. Public feuds sell documentaries. And as long as the money keeps flowing, the beef keeps breathing. Now here is the moment I want you to sit with. Because behind all of the trash talk, behind all of the album sales, behind all of the empty seats and screenshot wars, 50 Cent and Rick Ross have both contributed enormously to hip-hop. Both men have made classic records. Both men have made classic albums. Both men have paved the way for a generation of rapper entrepreneurs who now walk directly in their footsteps. Both men have shown the culture how to translate street success into corporate success. Both men have created blueprints for every artist that followed them. The tragedy of this feud is not that it exists. The tragedy is that two men who could have collaborated to build something historic instead spent 2 decades trying to dismantle each other. There is an alternate universe where 50 Cent and Rick Ross made a joint album that broke every record in hip-hop. There is an alternate universe where they built a joint business empire that dwarfed anything either of them accomplished separately. That universe is not this one. This one is the one where they keep fighting, keep swinging, and keep watching each other's downfalls with barely disguised satisfaction. But I gotta salute both of them, because they have earned their spots at this table. 50 Cent earned his by building empires most rappers cannot imagine. Rick Ross earned his by turning himself from a correctional officer into one of the most recognizable rap voices of a generation. Both men deserve their flowers. Both men deserve their legacies. Both men deserve their spot in the pantheon of hip-hop entrepreneurs. But right now, in this exact cultural moment, 50 Cent is standing on top of the mountain, and Rick Ross is at the base of that mountain, looking up, trying to figure out how he got there. That is the reality of the current moment. That is the reality of the Set in Stone album cycle. That is the reality that Rick Ross is going to have to sit with, wake up to, and try to reverse over the coming months and years. If Rick Ross can pull off the comeback, it will be one of the most historic reversals in hip-hop history. If Rick Ross cannot, This will be remembered as the moment 50 Cent officially closed the book on one of the longest rivalries the genre has ever known. There is a psychological element to all of this that I have not seen anyone discuss, and I think it deserves attention. 50 Cent has been publicly humiliated in his career. 50 Cent has been shot 9 times. 50 Cent has been dropped by labels. 50 Cent has been counted out by critics. 50 Cent has been declared washed up by every generation of hip-hop analysts. And every single time, 50 Cent has come back stronger. That is not luck. That is not coincidence. That is a specific personality trait that 50 Cent developed after his near-death experience. 50 Cent is not scared of failure the way most public figures are scared of failure. 50 Cent has already survived the worst possible outcome, literal death, and everything after that outcome is a bonus round. When you are playing on bonus rounds, you play recklessly. You play with a certainty that most competitors cannot match. That is why Rick Ross keeps losing to 50 Cent. Rick Ross is still trying to protect his image. 50 Cent stopped caring about his image years ago. And in a fight between someone trying to protect something and someone with nothing to lose, the person with nothing to lose wins every single time. Now, if you are still watching this, then you already know the story is bigger than an album. The story is bigger than a beef. The story is about the mechanics of how hip-hop actually operates in 2026. The story is about how legacy artists survive a streaming-first industry. The story is about how public feuds are used as marketing infrastructure. The story is about how a single Instagram post can undo a 2-decade reputation. The story is about how 50 Cent has become the most feared cultural operator in modern hip-hop, not because of his rap ability, but because of his understanding of narrative warfare. Rick Ross was a great rapper walking into a narrative fight. 50 Cent was a narrative operator wearing a rapper costume. That mismatch is why this particular round ended the way it did. That mismatch is why Rick Ross is now the case study. That mismatch is what every artist coming up behind them is going to have to solve if they want to have long careers in this industry. Drop your take in the comments and let the culture speak, because I need to hear from you on this one. Who do you think actually won the war between 50 Cent and Rick Ross? Do you think Rick Ross can rebuild from the Set in Stone disaster? Do you think 50 Cent is officially the most feared operator in hip-hop? Do you think Drake's involvement changed the balance permanently? Do you think the beef will ever actually end? Because I want to know where you stand. And while you are commenting, do me a favor and let me know if you want a deep dive on 50 Cent's business empire, because I have been sitting on a breakdown of the exact steps 50 Cent has taken to turn himself into a 9-figure media mogul, and I think it might be the most important video I have ever put out. Type the words Empire Breakdown in the comments if you want that next, and I will get it done for you. Because here is the thing you have to understand. 50 Cent didn't just beat Rick Ross this week. 50 Cent laid out a blueprint for how to end any public rival. Patience, receipts, timing, discipline, and asymmetric attack. Rick Ross walked into that blueprint like it was drawn just for him. And when the smoke cleared, the biggest boss in hip-hop was staring at the smallest first-week numbers of his entire career. 50 Cent didn't say a word. 50 Cent just posted. And the internet did the rest. That is the actual definition of winning a war without firing a bullet. That is the actual definition of cold-blooded execution. That is the actual reason 50 Cent is 50 Cent. And that is exactly why nobody in hip-hop should ever, under any circumstances, poke that bear again. So keep your eyes open, family, because this saga is not finished. Rick Ross is going to respond. 50 Cent is going to counter. And this beef is going to continue until one of them cannot physically continue anymore. Stay tuned. Stay tapped in. Stay ready. Because the next chapter of the 50 Cent versus Rick Ross story is already being written. And you already know I am going to bring it to you the moment it hits. Talk soon. SSS.